75 years ago, with the stroke of a pen, Britain's partition of India and Pakistan led to one of the largest mass migration and refugee crises ever. It had devastating consequences for families, for the economies of both countries, and cut ties between regions which had shared thousands of years of history. With us now on the lasting significance of that event and the prospects for better days ahead, we welcome, in New Delhi, India, Ajay Biseria, former High Commissioner of India to Canada, and who previously held that post to Pakistan as well. In London, England, Rohan Mukherjee, Assistant Professor of International Relations at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and author of Ascending Order, Rising Powers and the Politics of Status in International Institutions. In Boston, Massachusetts, Ayesha Jalal, the Mary Richardson Professor of History and Director of Tufts University's Center for South Asian and Indian Ocean Studies. And in Washington, D.C., Husein Haqqani, former ambassador of Pakistan to the United States, now Director for South and Central Asia at the Hudson Institute. And we are delighted to welcome the four of you to our program tonight for a timely discussion about an important moment 3/4 of a century ago. And let's start with a little background here. We're going to bring up a fact file and get some of the history on the record here before we begin our conversation. It was in August 1947 that the British ended their 200-year reign over the Indian subcontinent, dividing it into two separate countries, India with its Hindu majority and Pakistan with its Muslim majority. The boundary between the two countries, also known as the Radcliffe Line, named after the British bureaucrat who drew the line, was officially announced on August 17, 1947. That was 2 days after the independence of India and Pakistan. About 15 million people were uprooted and forced to move. About 2 million people died in the violence during the migration. Today, Kashmir remains the only region of British India that has not been fully integrated into one of the two countries or gained political independence. And one more, just so people can visualize it, the so-called Radcliffe Line was the boundary demarcated between the Indian and Pakistani portions of the Punjab province to the west and Bengal Presidency in the east of British India. Today, its western side is part of the India-Pakistan border, while its eastern side serves as the Bangladesh-India border. Ayesha Jalal, come on in here and tell us what the key factors were in the first place behind the partition idea.
Well, the common misconception is that partition was brought about because of religious differences. And I would like to emphasize that the reason for India's partition was the failure of the two main All India political parties, the Indian National Congress and the All India Muslim League, to arrive at a power sharing arrangement. And whilst people assume that religion was the primary factor, what is ignored is the role of regions. The partition of India was effectively the partition of Punjab and Bengal. When India was partitioned, there were 100 million Muslims at the time, of which 60 million became citizens of Pakistan, both east and west, separated by 1,000 miles, and 40 million were left inside India, making for the largest single Muslim minority in the world in a non-Muslim majority country at the time. So it was a very curious result. And I think the problem is that the presumption that religion alone brought about partition misses the regional dimension of the story. And I just conclude by saying that I think it's quite remarkable to continue to persist with the religious arguments when India is set to be, in 2050, become the largest Muslim country in the world. So I do think there's a very peculiar problem with the way partition is discussed and projected and consumed, if I may say.
Well, maybe we can resolve some of that over the next half hour as we continue our discussion. Ambassador Haqqani, let me get you in here at this point. Cyril Radcliffe, he was the lawyer who drew the lines on the map. He'd never set foot in India before doing so. Why was he put in charge of the partition plan?
Well, the British assumed that a fair judge would be able to divide the subcontinent much more fairly, and both sides agreed on him. I think that Dr. Jalal's point that there were political differences between the two major political parties was a significant factor, but I think that only talks about partition, the event. I would argue that there is also partition, the process, and that process is still continuing. Pakistan has become more Islamist, and India has become more Hindutva-oriented. And so the political process has taken a new dimension in which basically both sides have become less respectful of minorities. And as a result, the chance that there will be a settlement after which both countries will live happily ever after has just not materialized. The two countries have ended up becoming rivals forever in a way. And that is fed by the politics of each country. Pakistan inherited 1/3 of the British Indian Army, 17% of the resources, and 19% of the population. And as a result, the military became the most significant institution, which is still continuing. And on the Indian side, after the failure of the party that brought about both partition and independence, the Indian National Congress, a Hindu nationalist movement has taken root, which makes the Muslims in Pakistan feel that maybe the only thing we did right was break away from India. So the two countries have become more religiously, relatively more homogeneous, notwithstanding the fact that India has a much larger Muslim population than Pakistan has a Hindu population now.
High Commissioner Biseria, can I get you to weigh in on that with an accent on what you believe to be the biggest misconception all these years later about partition?
Well, I would agree with Dr. Jalal that one of the major misconceptions is that partition was inevitable. There was agency in all the historical actors of that time, but there was another factor, and that was British strategic interests. The departing colonial empire saw that its strategic interests lay in having a state carved from within the colonial India, which could keep away the Tsarist Russian Empire from coming south, and also take care of British interests in the Middle East. So that was also a driver which was responsible for partition ending up the way it did.
Professor Mukherjee, is there any way to know, 3/4 of a century later, whether the majority of public opinion was in favor of the solution that they ultimately came to?
Well, it's a difficult question to sort of ask at the time of the event, but even today, when you think about how individuals in India and Pakistan think about partition, it's both a distant event, but something that's still very present in the politics of both countries. And I think Ambassador Haqqani's point about how both countries' politics have moved in a more nationalist direction has an impact on how partition is remembered, and whether it was, in a sense, a justified act, or whether it has been vindicated by history. I think individuals on both sides now feel that the so-called two-nation theory that Muhammad Jinnah Ali Jinnah had put forward, that Hindus and Muslims needed two nations to coexist in South Asia. There are significant chunks of the population in both sides, in both countries now, that feel that perhaps that was indeed the right action for both countries to take.
And what's your view on the issue of whether or not it could have worked with everybody in one country? There were voices, obviously, that hoped for that believed that 75 years ago. What's your take on that?
Well, I think Professor Jalal sort of hits the nail on the head in the sense that when there is a struggle over political power, it's very difficult for these things to be resolved. I think Ambassador Biseria also pointed out the legacy of British colonialism. I think the way the British governed India created certain divisions between communities that sort of exacerbated pre-existing divisions in a way, and I think made it very difficult, almost, I wouldn't want to say inevitable, but really loaded the dice in favor of intercommunal disharmony at the time of decolonization.
Can I get you?
I would like to
please.
disagree here, because I do think that the ambassador's view that the British deliberately did this is belied by historical evidence. They tried very hard with the Cabinet Mission Plan to prevent a division. They even wanted to prevent a division of the Indian Army. So I do think that we need to bring in the internal politics, the differences between the two main political parties, as the primary reason for the division. I agree that the British used divide and rule to some extent to keep India whilst they were in power, but it made no sense necessarily across the board for them to divide when they quit. And I think the evidence is overwhelming that they did bend over backwards to prevent it from happening, and that it was just a disagreement, and it suited the Congress to divide rather than share power.
Ambassador, do you want to come back on that?
Yes, I leave it to the historians to debate this issue, but there is substantial historical evidence from British archives that also suggests that the British had this view that it would be in their interest, given that the Congress party led by Jawaharlal Nehru was not playing ball enough in terms of aligning to British interests after the British would leave. So I think this is a historical debate that goes on, and I know where Professor Jalal stands on it, and there are others who cite British archival evidence to suggest that British colonial interest was also a major factor.
We should hear from...
to decide, what people randomly say in documents. You need to have a policy. And if you can point me to that policy of the British government, I'll be able to take this position more seriously.
If I may come in at the moment, I would say that the historic argument is moot. Two nations exist. They have failed to get along for 75 years. And now what we should be looking at is the impact of partition on an entire subcontinent. There was a second partition in 1971, which was equally bloody. No partition is actually the solution of coexistence issues. We saw the partition of Yugoslavia becoming bloody as well. So what happened in 1947 was ethnic cleansing in Punjab primarily, where now in the Indian Punjab, there are very few Muslims left. And in Pakistani Punjab, where they were a significant part of the population, there are no Hindus and Sikhs left. And that has really poisoned the well. Now, on both sides, there are people who are the second generation, for example, people who were the children of people who went through that bloody partition, who have become the hardliners. And you see that pattern in both India and Pakistan. Hardliners driving the issue and making it into more of a religious argument. So while I may agree with Dr. Jalal over what happened historically, I would say the consequences of that historic development have been far more significant in terms of creating two countries that have failed to get along. It is no longer just...
Until you agree on why it happened, I really do think that that's really the fundamental problem. That if you insist that partition happened because of religion, and now you're saying that religion gains more emphasis, I don't deny it. It's an ongoing process. But what's been forgotten is the real issue, which was the federal question. And if we continue to ignore it, we continue to ignore the current problem as well, where there's an attempt being made to use centralization to deny the federal demands that exist in the subcontinent. And so it is, how you frame partition, why it happened, is not just a moot question. It's how you understand the consequences of partition as well. Because what you do is when you emphasize religion, you ignore the political dimension, the regional dimension that was a major factor driving
Jalal.
Ambassador Haqqani, you want to come back on that?
Party acts on the basis of religion, then religion does become the central question. How can you say that it just remains political because it's being pursued?
Religion as what? Religion as identity, as difference, not religion as faith. I do think that you're using religion rather loosely, Ambassador. And I think that we are far ahead with that to understand what it really means. You need to understand what role religion played in the partition of India, but to also account for the regional dimension that brought about the peculiarness of a partition India that was really the partition of Punjab and Bengal.
Well, Professor Mukherjee, to be sure, we are where we are today, and I wonder if we could look at the bilateral relationship of the two countries today, and in your judgment, what are the main points of conflict that exist today?
Thank you. Yes, I think the status of Kashmir remains, of course, as you already pointed out, a sort of significant pain point. Both countries have sort of fought wars over this a number of times. There's also the issue, as India points out, of sort of terrorism that takes place in Kashmir, which India alleges sort of sponsored by Pakistan, or at least groups that have safe haven in Pakistan. There's the issue of nuclear weapons between the two countries. People have argued that that's a source of instability, although one might see that as also preventing both countries from escalating to higher levels of conflict. And finally, I think the presence of sort of external powers like the United States and China has deeply complicated relations between the two countries on the subcontinent over the last 6 decades.
High Commissioner Biseria, is there anything you'd add to that list?
Yes, so I would agree with what Professor Mukherjee said. Terrorism certainly is a major concern for India and a major deal breaker. The territorial argument about Jammu and Kashmir is another factor. There are also deeper factors of identity and ideology, with Pakistan seeing itself as the other of India. The practical problem that India often faces in its conversations with Pakistan is who do you speak to? So the civil-military tension in Pakistan is also a factor in the diplomacy in who to address. And in many ways, the over-securitization of Pakistan's polity is a factor for India where Pakistan is seeing India as an existential threat, and that checks the discourse and makes it difficult to have those conversations.
Ambassador Haqqani, can I get you to weigh in on what you see the main points of departure are today?
The problem between India and Pakistan is more psychological than a political one right now. The Indian government right now, led by the BJP, needs Pakistan as the other. Pakistan has consistently needed India as the other to build a national identity. The federal problem that Dr. Jalal referred to has not been resolved in Pakistan as well. And so to overcome that, religion has been emphasized much more, whether as identity or as faith. I personally am one of those who thinks that whenever religion is invoked, it is inevitable, whether it's as identity or pure faith, that the faith dimension will prevail, which is what has happened in the case of Pakistan. It has moved more and more towards identifying the faith elements of what was essentially a very loose Muslim identity at the time of partition. So Pakistan has had that dimension. India is also having that process right now, makes talks very difficult. Terrorism continues to be a major factor. And on the Indian side, the position is that unless that is resolved, we will not talk to Pakistan. So the two countries haven't had dialogue for several years, which makes it even more difficult to restart the dialogue in the near future.
Professor Jalal, your view on this?
Well, I think that the biggest stumbling block in Indo-Pakistan discussions and towards a resolution is the persistence of the colonial paradigm that both have embraced and have refused to move on. The paradigm I refer to is the idea of a monolithic, non-negotiable sovereignty. And therefore, there can be no question of accommodating regional aspirations without accusing them of secession. So I think that this colonial mentality and the persistence of that in the post-colonial state is really one of the major hurdles in the way of India and Pakistan moving ahead in a more creative way that can accommodate their differences without necessarily undermining their mutual claims to sovereignty. South Asia has a history of shared sovereignty. And what both countries have done is to not just embrace a British importation idea, and it's an idea, a discursive idea of a monolithic sovereignty, which even the British themselves for a while gave away with the EU. But I do think that it's these ideas and the inability to move away from the colonial paradigm that I would say is the primary factor.
Now, this relationship, of course, not only existed in its own part of the world, but it was also caught up in a whole subplot of Cold War politics, geopolitics, relations with China, the Soviet Union / Russia, the United States. Can I get you all to weigh in on what role you think all of that, all those external factors have played in the either worsening or occasionally improving relations between India and Pakistan? High Commissioner Biseria, why don't you go first?
Sure. I think the major powers have always had major influence on subcontinental politics. If you look at 1971, when India and Pakistan had a major conflict, Pakistan was used by the United States, by Nixon, for an outreach to China. And India at the same time signed a friendship treaty with the Soviet Union. Today we see a reversal in many of the geopolitical relationships. We see that India has the US and Russia as strategic partners, but sees China today as a strategic adversary. And for Pakistan, I think the relationship with the US, and Ambassador Haqqani has written about it at length, has been a tumultuous one. But at this point, I think Pakistan is trying to balance its relationship with China and the US. With China, it has a relationship of excessive dependence, and that it feels affects its relationship with the US. So the great powers matter, but I would make the point that India and Pakistan at the end of the day have to solve their problems bilaterally. The great powers will not come, the major powers will not come and solve India and Pakistan's mutual bilateral issues. We will have to find ways and means of doing it ourselves.
Why do you say that the great powers, at the end of the day, will not be helpful enough to make progress?
Well, to begin with, they often come with their own agendas. The second point is that both India and Pakistan have, since 1971, tried various methods and then said that bilateralism is the way forward, and we need to be talking to each other to resolve these issues. And this is the position taken, for instance, by the United States, that they would like to get into this only if requested by both parties. And at this point of time, neither of the parties wants this.
Gotcha. Professor Mukherjee, can I get you to weigh in on this issue of how the great powers have influenced this bilateral relationship over the years?
Sure. I think there's a difference between what the great powers say and what they do. I think that they say that this is a matter for bilateral resolution and that India and Pakistan should pursue their own policies. But by sort of putting their finger on one or the other side of the scale throughout sort of the last 6-7 decades, they have, of course, influenced the way India and Pakistan can approach each other. So, for example, the United States and China both have been, Pakistan's allies from much of the Cold War, although the US relationship was much more instrumental and fraught in some ways. The Soviet Union and India had a very close relationship, and India's relationship today with Russia remains very close based on a defense supply relationship. So long as the great powers are looking for arms markets and sort of places to tip the geopolitical scale and gain influence against each other, these countries are now sort of the front line of US-China competition as well. So it's difficult to see how this is not a cause of some of the difficulties in resolving the relationship.
Ambassador Haqqani, I'd be interested in your view, and I hope you don't think this is too chippy a question here, but when you were the ambassador of Pakistan to the United States, did you get the feeling that the American government genuinely cared about what happened in Pakistan, or did they genuinely care only in as much as Pakistan could be useful in their struggles against, say, China or the Soviet Union, whatever?
I think that the Americans generally do care about the countries that they have relations with, but that stops at the point where their interests come into play. And so were there American interests relating to Pakistan at the time because of the Afghan war? Definitely. Have those interests diminished significantly? Absolutely. But then the fact that Pakistan did not help America in Afghanistan the way America expected, and that we made promises that we did not keep, that has definitely put off the Americans, which is why the United States no longer looks at Pakistan in the same way. But the fact remains that over the last 75 years, Pakistan's economic and military supply relationship with the United States has been very important for Pakistan. Pakistan would have had greater difficulty in maintaining the large military it inherited from the British if the Americans had not stepped in and helped. So the US has poured money, it has poured weapons into Pakistan, and a lot of it has benefited the people of Pakistan. Like all such relationships, it is to the advantage of the Americans to do it, and that is the reason why they did it. They didn't do it out of just the love for the people of Pakistan. No country does that with any other country.
So that reality does not offend you then?
I think that reality is a reality. And so, I mean, you can get offended as much as you like, but that reality is a reality. You go to another country, you want economic support. They always look at what is in it for them. And similarly, when it comes to military supply relationships, that is always strategic. No one will arm a country unless and until they think that it is to their strategic advantage.
Understood. Professor Jalal, I wonder if I could get you to look at the other side of the coin, namely this so often fraught relationship between India and Pakistan. What kind of impact do you think that has had on the diasporas of both countries who live abroad and live so much of this as a part of their daily lives, even though they're a long way away from it?
Well, I mean, I think the diaspora has a little bit more options, a few more options. I mean, culturally they come together, but politically they disagree. So if it's a conference on Kashmir, you can rest assured that the diaspora splits. But if it's a musical gathering, the diaspora comes together. If it's a food gathering, they come together. So the diaspora is varied, but I would say that partition has, and the separation and the hostilities between India and Pakistan have had a deep impact on the way in which South Asian diasporic population views itself. But I still would have to say that there is a difference in terms of how things have changed over time. So if we look at the earlier period of the diaspora and now, I mean, when you look at the early diasporic populations, they integrated, they worked together, and now I think the divisions get politicized a lot more because of India and Pakistan and their differences.
Ambassador Biseria, I'd be interested in your take on this as the former High Commissioner from India to Canada. What did you see in terms of the diasporas when you were on duty here?
Well, I would agree with Professor Jalal that, the culture often brings them together, but the polarized politics of back home, when they transpose it to their new homes, that divides them again. And I think there has been a recent trend of greater division, given technology, given mobility, given social media. There has been a trend of diasporas becoming more polarized, getting the divisive politics from back home. And I think that is a point of worry. If you are in Leicester or in Brampton, you don't have the benefit of those borders to keep you from each other. And we had an instance in the UK recently of India-Pakistan cricket match turning into a bit of a riot. So I think this is something we need to worry about. Often we feel that diasporas are weaponized by state agencies and they're used for protests. I used to have outside the Indian High Commission in Ottawa a large number of protests. You would have seen them in Toronto. We feel that these are diasporas that are used by various state agencies to create trouble. So I think we need to watch this trend. We need to be careful, and we need to advise the diasporas to live in greater harmony.
Ambassador Haqqani, same question to you. When you had responsibilities for Pakistan in the United States, what impact did you see all of this playing on the community on the diaspora community in the U.S.?
The diaspora works very well in cultural settings. They eat at the same restaurants. They listen to the same music. But I agree that both sides have weaponized the diaspora, and the political differences have become much more pronounced. And with the social media, it is very easy to rile people up. And both sides do that, and not to the advantage of the diaspora, but to be able to build a narrative back home that the diaspora is active, and that will result in the great powers or the major powers where the diaspora is located taking sides. So it becomes political, and the politics always divides.
Okay, Ambassador Biseria, the Cricket World Cup is underway in Australia. And India and Pakistan are going to face off in a highly anticipated game this weekend. And given that cricket for these countries is a bit like hockey for Canadians, of course it's going to be very tense in the short run as they face each other. But I wonder if in the long run, sports can be beneficial here to bringing more harmony at the end of the day. What do you think?
Absolutely, yes. In fact, we've seen this in the past in the India-Pakistan context. We've tried often what we call cricket diplomacy. Pakistan's then dictator Zia-ul Haq dropped in India in 1987. President Musharraf dropped in India in 2005. both times to watch a cricket match. There was another Prime Minister, Gilani, who'd also gone to India. So cricket has often been used as a setting for diplomatic conversations. When I met Imran Khan for the first time, Prime Minister Imran Khan, as you know, was a cricketing hero of Pakistan. I presented him with a cricket bat signed by the entire Indian cricket team. I don't know how much it helped his thinking and his attitude towards India, but certainly we have attempted cricket diplomacy often. I would only say that if India and Pakistan could find ways of having this fiercely competitive game of cricket and have out all their rivalries on the cricket field and not on the borders, we would be in a much better space.
Ambassador Haqqani, I guess I should point out we're 50 years since the original hockey summit series between Canada and the Soviet Union, and the players absolutely despised each other at the time and then went on to become very good friends for the most part. Do you think that's possible with cricket and the World Cup happening this weekend?
The fact remains that the reason why that happened in case of Canada and the Soviet Union was that eventually the Soviet Union collapsed. And so that took away the political reason for the hatred and dislike. Let's be honest. It's great to watch India and Pakistan play cricket because they both play it with a lot of passion. It's great to see the crowd because the Indians and the Pakistanis in the crowd are always very passionate about an India-Pakistan cricket game. And yes, there have been occasions when Pakistani leaders have taken the opportunity of a cricket match to be able to travel to India and get a diplomatic process going when diplomacy was not easy otherwise. But that said, in the end, relations between states are always about the politics, and the politics also poisons the sports. The sports does not change the politics per se. It just becomes another prop for the politics.
All right, let me ask one last question, and we'll go to Drs. Mukherjee and Jalal on this one. Can you imagine a future where these two countries are friends again? And if so, what will that take? Professor Mukherjee, start us off, please.
Thank you. I think those are two separate questions. I don't think I can imagine a future in which, to be pessimistic, it's a very difficult future to imagine. But I would say if it were to happen, it would have to involve a settlement of the Kashmir issue. I think greater civilian control of the military in Pakistan, and also a different political dispensation in both places in terms of nationalistic outlooks on the other, as has been discussed. Those are tall. That's a very tall order. So.
And Professor Jalal.
Well, I mean, I think I've already said so, that if they can stand out of the colonial paradigm and stop seeing each other through that colonial paradigm, I think that there is a lot of possibility, potentially. I agree that there is, in the near future, given the politics of the two countries currently, there is no chance of a breakthrough. But over a period of time, and I think that can be facilitated if backroom diplomacy continues, leads to some people-to-people interaction. A breakthrough is not on the cards. We need to basically get out of the colonial way of treating each other. And I think that's a very large question, which I can't completely address. But I have pointed to one, which is a sovereignty. The other is the view that anyone who asserts a regional demand is necessarily a secessionist. So I really think that we have bought into the colonial way of thinking so much that we have lost the ability to think what is in our own best interest. And if we can do that, I still think that over a period of years, we could potentially avoid the frightful water wars that are hovering on the horizon, and without some measure of international nudging, are unlikely to be resolved. So that's what I would say.
And let's get the two ambassadors on this as well. Ambassador Biseria, can these countries become friends again? And if so, how does it happen?
Well, I think that's the title of a book by Ambassador Haqqani, so he should give you a detailed menu. But, you know, I would say that there are 3 or 4 things we could do. Firstly, it's important to bridge this deficit of trust. I think the first thing to be done is to stop terrorism. That, from India's point of view, is very important. That's a deal breaker. And that can be done by the military establishment itself and without the civilians being involved. Secondly, I think it's important to give diplomacy a chance. I was expelled when I was High Commissioner in Pakistan in August 2019, and since then we haven't had High Commissioners. You need senior diplomats to have those conversations, to do some creative diplomacy, to get to a spot where we can look at the modus vivendi of our forward movement. And I think thirdly, it's important to be pragmatic. Because it's important to remember that India had a relationship which was troubled also with Bangladesh, which was the former Eastern Pakistan. And that relationship has improved dramatically. We've managed land, water, river agreements. We do trade. We have $18 billion of trade. So that stands as a model of what can be done from the partitioned eastern wing of Pakistan. We already have a great relationship, and I think it's feasible, it's possible, and we need to keep working at it.
Last word to Ambassador Haqqani.
In 1947, the founder of Pakistan, Mr. Muhammad Ali Jinnah, in an interview with Canadian radio, said that he looks forward to a relationship between Pakistan and India that would be more like the relationship between Canada and the United States. And what is the relationship between Canada and the United States? It is not that they don't have outstanding issues, but they do not make them the basis of military action. They have a relatively open border. They allow their people to go into each other's countries quite easily. And they have a huge trade relationship. If Pakistan and India can work towards that and understand that those have to be the priorities rather than the issues that divide them, then they can definitely move forward into having a more positive relationship. Diplomacy is definitely needed. Expelling each other's high commissioners and not having major diplomatic processes ongoing is not a recipe for positive relations. And certainly, if Canada had been sending terrorists into the U.S. or U.S. had terrorists going into Canada, that would not have been very conducive to positive relations between these two North American neighbors. That is not conducive to relations in South Asia as well.
Can I thank the four of you for spending so much time with us here on TVO tonight? Ambassadors Biseria and Haqqani, Professors Mukherjee and Jalal, it was great to have you on TVO. Thank you so much for sharing your views with us in this 75th anniversary year of the partition of India and Pakistan. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.